June 4, 1942, dawn breaking over the central Pacific, 15,000 feet northwest of Midway Atoll, the air thin and bitter against leather masks. The ocean below lies iron, blue and flecked with whitecaps, the kind of morning that makes men think the sky favours them. On the carriers Akogi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu deck crews have long since cleared the last chocks and 108 aircraft. D-3A1 Val-5 bombers, B-5 Endron 2 KT level bombers, and A-6 IM-2 Model 21 Zeros are already droning southeast in a tight, calculated geometry. The formation breathes confidence. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga, rides the air with cold precision. The instruments steady at altitude and speed, headings checked as the sun climbs. The cockpit smells of fuel, canvas and salt. On Eastern Island Midway's SCR-270 radar turns, a green line sweeping the scope. A stranger's eye looking far beyond the horizon. The operator leans into his headset as a lump of light grows fat on the bearing. Many bogies. Bearing 320, range 90 miles. The report crackles across the island net, the words hard, clipped, unmistakable. A siren replies. Marine Fighting Squadron 221 scrambles F-2A3 Buffalos and F-4F3 Wildcats into a sky they already know is unfair, props clawing at the warm air with impatient blades. They climb because orders say climb. The Japanese formation keeps its tiers, zeros on the high perch, Vels above 10,000, Kates lower, steady and deliberate, their bomb racks loaded for a base that looks like a strip of sand and coral. They trust formations more than whispers. The Americans trust a moving line of light on a cathode face and the mathematics of bearings and range, measuring salvation in minutes. They have learned to believe in what they cannot see. Air raid Midway, flashes through operations, and men run to guns, the smell of cordite already imagined in their throats. The island shudders awake. The Kido Butai has no air search radar. Lookouts do the old work with sharpened eyes and binocular glass as the sun floods the eastern quadrant. The carriers are blind where the Americans are not. The first contrails etch themselves high and white, threads that twist and fatten as the marine fighters struggle to intercept. They rise into a cold they cannot outclimb. Dive. Bomber canopies slide back an inch as pilots test visibility. Gloved hands finding the dive brakes and arming switches by feel. Rituals fight fear. A zero barrel rolls lazily above them. Sunlight flashing off the HE steel of its wing-root guns. The pilot checking his element leader and the sun angle. Confidence is a habit. On the horizon, Midway stands small but stubborn, a wavering smudge of palms, sand, and emplacements waiting under camouflage nets. The atoll looks fragile. The men on it are not. The formation holds its course, bilingual radios murmuring brevity codes and altitudes. The Japanese aircrews keyed to strike and return to decks cleared for a second blow. A plan is a comforting thing. Below the clouds, the island's guns lift their muzzles, and the first puffs of black rise in ugly flowers that smell of nitrates and oil. The air turns dirty, beneath another stretch of sky hours and miles away but closing fast. SBD-3 Dauntless Dive. Bombers of VB-6 and VS-6 search empty ocean at 19,000 feet, their right cyclones beating a relentless rhythm into the aluminum frames. Patience is a thin resource at altitude. Commander Wade McCluskey sees a wake line cut like a white scar through the swell. Destroyer Arashi, racing to regain station, and banks his group north-northwest, trusting instinct sharpened by fuel gauges that read less than kind. If we don't find them now, we'll never find them, he tells his wingman, a flat truth over an open ocean. Back near Midway, Tomonaga's bombers sled toward their push. Over points, steady and mechanical, each man enclosed by his own cockpit canopy, and the rules they drilled in the inland sea. The dive angles feel like destiny. Marine guns rake at silhouettes sliding down out of the sun, and Zeros carve across their climbs with a surgeon's economy. The blue, grey fighters tumbling through tracer and smoke. Courage meets physics. Bombs fall on Midway's runways and oil tanks at UO 630 local. Explosions rising in orange towers that throw heat into men's faces and shrapnel into the scrub. The ground shakes like a drum. Above the open sea to the northwest, a Japanese scout finally corrects an earlier, incomplete sighting and keys the message that matters. Sighted what appears to be 10 enemy ships, including carriers. Tones no. 4 aircraft sends urgency down a thin wire of radio to Nagumo's flagship. On Akagi's flag bridge, the signal men repeat the words and the decision tree changes shape, branching where once it had been straight. Time becomes the enemy. And at 10:20, when the sun is higher and the smoke of Midway still smears the horizon, the Dauntlesses break through a patchwork of cloud over Kaga and Akagi. Dive flaps open, noses dropping like guillotines. The trap reveals itself all at once. Glass vibrates, altimeters unwend, and the Pacific rears up as men ride their dives into the heart of the enemy's pride. The sky becomes a scream of metal and wind. Months earlier, in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort's team at Station HYPO sifted JN-25 code groups until a single ruse turned guesswork into certainty. The cable they engineered, AF is short of water, drew a confirming Japanese broadcast that Midway was the target, a dry truth sent over a wet ocean. Knowledge became ambush. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz moved the pawns that were not pawns. Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance with Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher with the battered but battle, ready Yorktown, into a quadrant of ocean northeast of Midway. The carriers rode the swells with their CXAM-1 air, search radar turning like a quiet lighthouse above steel, grey decks. They came early to wait. The Japanese plan, Operation MI, was Yamamoto's grand design to draw out the remaining American carriers and crush them with First Air Fleet, Kido Butai, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The approach from the northwest, masked by a simultaneous feint to the Aleutians, looked like inevitable geometry on a planner's chart. On paper, the trap seemed theirs. But Kido Butai sailed without air search radar, relying on binoculars, horizon scans, and a reconnaissance screen of float planes from cruisers Tone and Chikuma to find what mattered. A catapult delay on Tone's no. 4 Scout would ripple into history, as minutes lost became decisions strained by doubt and fuel. The blind spot was real. Midway itself was a coral airbase stretched thin across sand and scrub, yet it bristled with new ice. SCR-270 radar spinning on Eastern Island, marine gunners drilling arcs of fire, and PBY Cataliners sweeping the dawn with long rubber wings. The night before the main blow, PBY crews attacked the approaching invasion group and torpedoed the oiler Akibono Maru, proof that the atoll could still reach. Warning hummed before the sun rose. Nagumo's air groups embodied Japan's sharpest edge. A6M2 Model 21 Zeros with twin-type 9920 minor MCANs and 7.7 mm machine guns, HED-3A1 VAL dive bombers with cranked wings and clean lines, and Nakajima B5N2 Kate bombers trained to drop either land bombs or the shallow, running Type 91 torpedo with its wooden tail fairing. They were fast, long-legged, and flown by men who had not tasted defeat. Confidence was doctrine. American defenders were a patchwork of grit and stopgaps. Marine Fighting Squadron 121's F-2A3 Buffalos and a handful of F-4F-3 Wildcats, underpowered against Zeros, thick-skinned but outclimbed, while on the carriers the SBD-3 Dauntlesses and F-4F-4 Wildcats drilled into their pilots a different gospel. Hold formation. Dive straight, shoot once, and live. The island's scent of fuel and salt blew over camouflaged revetments as ordnance crews hefted AM-M64 and AM-65 bombs under the dauntless bellies. They would fight with what they had. From Tokyo to Truk. Japanese aviators measured American fighters by peacetime encounters and early war routes and expected Midway's defenders to be obsolete. They pictured buffaloes climbing into the sun like slow pigeons. Underestimation formed the first layer of the trap. On the flag bridge of Akagi, staff officers worked Nagumo's standard playbook: launch a dawn strike, recover, ram, and deliver the coup de grace with torpedoes against any ships that dared to contest the sea. The message from Tomonaga's first wave: second attack necessary, arrived as black smoke climbed from Midway's oil tanks and anti-aircraft. Bursts still flecked the sky. The plan bent at the first report. To rearm the reserve from land bombs to torpedoes meant time hoists, and ordnance laid out across hangar decks that were busy with the returning strike. It meant vulnerable minutes. Minutes are everything at sea. American early warning changed those minutes into Vectus radar scopes on Midway, and carrier decks turned contacts into headings, while PBYs and B-17s threw weight and courage into shadowing reports. Sighted main body. Messages crackled toward Fletcher and Spruance. The ocean map in their minds, narrowing with each bearing and range. They could see because they listened. The Japanese could not imagine the green sweep of a scope that saw them at 90 miles. Nor that Nimitz had committed his carriers based on code groups deciphered in a room that smelled of coffee and pencil shavings. They flew in tight Vic formations beneath a rising sun and trusted the old senses to keep them safe. Faith outran caution. At 1,000 hours, high above a spread of whitecaps and cloud tatters, Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise group angled toward a solitary wake. The destroyer Arashi racing to rejoin after depth, charging the submarine Nautilus. And he wrote the sentence that bridged luck and judgment. I decided to follow this course. The decision cut across empty sky with the certainty of a compass needle snapping north. Instinct found steel. Yorktown, scarred from the Coral Sea and repaired in 70, 2 frantic hours at Pearl, carried CXAM-1 atop her island, and a hardened crew below decks who understood that one good day could change a war. Her F-4 Wildcats would cover VB-3's Dauntlesses, while Hornet's air group, confused by miscommunication and wind, would pay a grim price to the west. Sacrifice stacked in unseen columns. On the Japanese side of the horizon, Tomonaga's pilots had done their job precisely and asked for the follow-up they had trained to deliver. On the American side, radar, code-breaking, and a commander willing to trust both had brought 3 carriers to a stretch of sea where the enemy did not expect them. The geometry reversed without a sound, and as the seconds ticked down toward the first plunging dives, the contrast hardened eyes versus electronics, habit versus adaptation, certainty versus the thin edge of chance. The stage was small, the consequences enormous. The sky waited, humming with propellers and fate. The Japanese carrier air arm flew to Midway atop machines honed for reach and precision. ASIC M2 Model 21 Zeros with 20 mm of Type 99 cannons and 7.7 mm machine guns, D3A1 Vial dive bombers with cranked wings for stable plummets, and B5N2, Kate, torpedo bombers trained to drop the shallow, running Type 91 against hulls and harbours alike. Elegance hid fragility. The Zero's light structure, low wing loading, and 331 MAF top speed at altitude gave it ballot in the horizontal. Its lack of armour and self, sealing tanks buying agility with blood. It could dance, but it could not bleed. Japan's torpedo was a doctrine in metal. The Type 91, with wooden tail fairings and anti-roll devices, entered the sea clean, then ran shallow enough to menace ships in lagoon and roadstead, a weapon refined since Pearl Harbor. It punished mistakes. Kido Butai's method was a deckload symphony: launch the maximum, strike as a single blow, and recover with hangars staged for the next act. Its fighter direction dependent on lookouts and timing rather than electromagnetic eyes. Speed stood in for sensors. Second attack necessary, came Tomonaga's report after the first strike on Midway, a concise calculus of damage, ordnance, and time transmitted into the morning air. The clock ruled everything. Across the water, American doctrine leaned on a different trinity: radar, disciplined formations, and rugged airframes that could take hits and still fight. Seeing became strength. Midway's SCR 270 could often catch high formations at 90 to 130 miles, its green sweep converting wind and distance into vectors that gunners and pilots could read. A ghost lantern in the dark. On the Carrier Islands, CXAM-1 antenna turned with quiet inevitability. Early air, search sets that gave task force commanders 60 to 90 miles of warning on inbound raids. Enough time to launch, climb, and stack a chap in layered altitude bands. Minutes turned into altitude. The F4F4 Wildcat was no fencer, but its 50 caliber guns, armor, and self-sealing tanks made it a street fighter. Its Grumman Iron Works frame born to survive vertical dives and snap rolls that would tear the Zero's skin. It took hits and kept turning. John S. Thatch's beam defense, weave, practiced over Ewa Field against friendly stand, ins and flown for real by VF-3 off Yorktown, turned two Wildcats into a single rotating trap that baited the Zero into deflection fire. Teamwork defeated grace. The weave worked. Thatch wrote in his action report, noting that the crossing geometry forced attackers into the sights of a wingman waiting with throttles set and guns hot. A diagram became salvation. Dive bombing was its own creed, the SBD-3 Dauntless with perforated dive flaps, an 870 HP Wright R-1820 Cyclone, and a centerline shackle that carried a 1,000-pound AM-M65 or a 500-pound AM-M64 into a 70 to 80-degree dive. Stability was everything. Pilots opened brakes around 12,000 feet, trimmed nose down, and rode the whistle of air over perforated metal until the target grew to fill the ring and bead sight, releasing around 500 feet before hauling through blackout into recovery. Precision killed carriers. In the rear cockpit, twin 30 caliber Brownings chattered defense, while self-sealing tanks and armor plates made the SBD-3 heavier than earlier marks, but far more survivable under tracer and shrapnel. Weight bought time. The TBD Devastator, slow at just over 200 mmf and burdened by the unreliable Mark 13 torpedo, often demanding drops below 50 feet and near 100 knots to avoid a tumble, was a brave anachronism that asked its crews to fly straight into the fiercest fire. Courage outpaced technology. On deck, American ordnance crews fitted an Mk-33 delay fuses to armor, piercing bombs when expected to face carriers, while flyers drilled at holding tight Vs to the release point. Japanese armorers shifted between land bombs and torpedoes on hangar decks, where fueled aircraft and munitions lay too close for comfort. Procedures decided fates. Japanese carrier design prioritized offensive tempo, spacious hangars, light protection topside, and fuel lines that ran long and lively beneath the decks. Ideal for generating sorties, catastrophic when perforated by hot metal. Speed turned to tinder. American damage control, forged in the peacetime habits of drills and reinforced hatches, emphasized rapid counterflooding, foam and CO2, and compartmentalization that could starve a fire and rebalance a wounded ship in minutes. Practice bred resilience. PBY-5 Catalinas, with their twin Pratt and Whitney R-1830s and ocean-spanning endurance, stitched search arcs through night and dawn, marking bearings and speeds while their crews scribbled position lines on wet chart tables. Patience became reach. Japanese reconnaissance doctrine depended on cruiser floatplanes catapulted at prescribed intervals, a net that could tear if one scout launched late or reported imprecisely. Like Tone's no. 4 delayed just enough to bend the morning's logic. A gap became a wound. When Yorktown's fighter directors took radar plots and turned them into headings, Vector 3, 1, 0, Angels 12. Wildcats moved not to where the enemy was but to where he would be, a shift in thinking as decisive as any salvo. Prediction replaced surprise. Kido Butai's combat air patrol, brilliant pilots in A6M2s flying by eye and instinct, waited to be pointed by men scanning horizons and smoke columns, their radio net sparse and their picture fragmented by distance and glare. They were fast, but they were late. Both sides carried the distilled lessons of 2 years of war into the morning. Metal and doctrine fused with muscle memory. Yet only one side let invisible mathematics lead their steel, and invisibility would tip the scale. The torpedo squadrons find the carriers first. VT-8 from Hornet at Wave, top height around 0920. VT-6 from Enterprise minutes later. VT-3 from Yorktown near Thunton 10. Flying straight and slow into curtains of 25 mm at fire and 0 attacks that carve aluminum like wet paper. Bravery bleeds altitude. On Akaji's bridge the reports stack with the rhythm of routine. Torpedo planes spotted. Bearing 150. Cappy engage, turn into the wind. And the Zeros scythe down to sea level to kill what looks like the only threat. The sky above is left unguarded. Those boys were heroes. Ensign George Gay would write after watching from the water. But their attack pulled the fighters down. Sacrifice opened a door. At 10,000 feet higher and drifting out of the sun, Enterprise's VB-6 and VS-6 arrive because one wake on an empty ocean told McCluskey where to go. Judgment becomes geometry. Dive brakes clatter open. The SBD's perforated petals grabbing air as altimeters unwind, and the targets fill to the rim of ring, and bead sights on Kaga, and off her bow, Akagi. Silence turns to a whistle. Commence attack. McCluskey signals by hand. Then rolls into the void with his lead element, as the rest follow in a waterfall of blue-grey. Gravity takes command. The first bombs walk up Kaga's flight deck. 1,000. Pounders armed with delayed fuses punching through planks to hangar decks where fueled aircraft and lines of Avgas turn a tidy warship into a chimney stack. Order becomes kindling. From a dauntless over Kaga, LT says a G. Norman Dusty. Kleiss later recalled, I put the Pippa right on the flight deck and let her go. A thumbprint decides fates. On Akaji's flag bridge, staff officers feel the ship shudder as near Mrs. Geiser water high, then a single bomb from VB-6 leader Richard H. Best spears the deck just abaft the midships elevator to explode in the hangar. One hit is enough. Hit near after elevator, fire spreading rapidly. Akaji's action notes would summarize with a calm that life no longer matched. Paper can't show heat. Yorktown's VB-3 under LT-LMR. Maxwell F. Leslie comes in from a different quadrant at 10,000 feet, cutting their dives onto Soryu as white wake lines intersect into fate's compass rose. Convergence becomes slaughter. Leslie's own bomb fails to arm and is jettisoned to sea, but his squadron's aim is true and 3 hits slam Soryu's hangars into a furnace that draws men and air into an upward roar. Luck bows to numbers. On Kaga, explosions blossom through canvas and gasoline vapor. The after elevator blasts upward, and fragments scythe along the hangar like a scalding wind. Steel breathes fire. A Zero pilot, circling to land and low on fuel, sees it happen and later writes in his diary of flames racing the length of the ship. Triumph turns to ash. On Akaji's flight deck the rising sun roundel is briefly a clear aiming point, then vanishes under smoke as the ship shears out of formation and lists with a wounded animal's stagger. Pride wobbles. Enemy dive bombers overhead. Someone shouts in Japanese, Teki Bakajiki, as 25 Malarizan's mounts chatter skyward and tracers make red ladders too late to climb. Realization arrives late. Best hauls through blackout into recovery, the SBD yowing as Slipstream fights dive breaks, and looks back to see an orange flower burst from Akaji's waist and grow into a rolling boil of black. Confirmation is a glance over the shoulder. On Soryu, crews trying to launch SAP are caught between orders and physics. The deck suddenly, a chessboard swept, by a giant hand, as one bomb strikes forward of the bridge and another near the amidship's elevator. Routine dies mid-sentence. From the waterline, George Gay watches the carriers burn and writes simply, "I saw 3 Japanese carriers afire." Witness reduces war to fire and smoke. Kido Butai's coherence unravels in minutes. Kaga mortally hit. Soryu a roaring pyre, Akaji fatally wounded, while Hiryu, out on the flank, alone retains her sting. A quartet becomes a solitary blade. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo transfers his flag as damage control teams fight a losing battle against aviation fuel lines, open trunks, and the hungry physics of draft. Experience cannot seal every seam. Enterprises dive, bombers form back into ragged elements, planes counting holes and wingmen, and turn for the northeast with fuel gauges honest and throats dry. Survival is a procedure. The carriers that had laughed at antiquated fighters and unarmoured island airstrips now list amidships with hangar bulkheads, groaning and sailors pushing aircraft toward the edges to make space for hoses. Arrogance meets reality in smoke. Hiryu's counterpunch will still come, but the Empire's finest sword has already broken at the hilt under 3 plunging dives and 100 seconds of perfect alignment. Shock breathes in the pauses between explosions.